Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello and welcome to episode 10 of the Stark Reflections podcast. If you can't tell from the slight change to my voice, I'm a little under the weather right now with a bit of a cold and flu. I'll be addressing that in the post-interview reflection part of this podcast. And I'm just back from a delightful trip to Oregon and the Oregon coast for a great writing anthology workshop, as well as a bit of research for a forthcoming book about haunted bars and breweries, which you can check out via the website spiritsuntapped.com. But right now, I'm really excited to share this great interview with Jean Leggett, CEO and co-founder of One More Story Games. After her husband Blair's near-death experience in 2012, the two embarked on a journey back to his childhood hometown to each pursue their life's passion, which includes the company One More Story Games and their software StoryStylus, which simplifies video game creation for storytellers to create, publish, and share story-based games. It's an amazing interview. Jean is very inspiring, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy this interview. Hey, Jean, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Mark. It's great to talk to you again.
It is. So I know about One More Story Games, but I'm pretty sure my listeners may not have heard about this awesome company. Could you tell us a little bit about One More Story Games and how it got started?
Sure. So One More Story Games is the brainchild of Blair Legget, and I kind of say that he's the visionary. So we have developed a simplified software platform for writers to take their short stories and novels and transform them into interactive, narrative-based video games. That's it in a nutshell.
Okay.
So we help them create the content and publish it and market it.
Okay, so there's kind of the One More Story Games website at onemorestorygames.com, and then StoryStylus is the tool that writers can use. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So StoryStylus is the underlying engine of One More Story Games, and we kind of call it a fancy word processor. So think about your story elements broken down into Lego pieces. Your people, places, things, conversations, relationships between characters. And we've actually been teaching kids how to use the software for the last couple of summers. And if you go to our website, there's a 10-minute game called Attack of the Killer Zombie Cats USA Edition that an 11-year-old girl, Kira, created. Now, you play as Barack or Michelle Obama to defeat Trumpy Cat. I will say it's not the most riveting game you've ever played in your life, but it's funny, and it also proves that if an 11-year-old child can understand the concepts of storytelling, like the story bricks as they were, then we can effectively also teach adult writers how to transform their stories into interactive narrative.
That is amazing. So this 11-year-old with a great imagination, as many children have, and then we usually beat that imagination out of them as they get older, but this 11-year-old with a great imagination was actually able to come in, use the tool, and create a game that people around the world can enjoy.
Yes. And it's the very same software that these 10, 11, 12-year-olds are using that we are currently using to adapt a novel by Charlaine Harris, which is, as readers and writers will remember from the Sookie Stackhouse series, which became True Blood on HBO. So we're working with Charlaine right now to adapt one of her mysteries called the Lily Baird series.
Yeah, and so the last time I think we saw each other in person was at an event in Toronto with you and Blair and Charlaine Harris and her entourage and a whole bunch of guests as you were doing an interactive sharing of the game as well as interviewing Charlaine about that.
Yes, and Kobo was a fantastic sponsor of the event, and thank you for all of the work that you and your team did when you were with Kobo there. it was really great because I think for the consistent response that we get from readers and writers is, I didn't know this was possible.
Right.
And there are writing tools out there, but they require some degree of technical proficiency to be able to create the interactive content with.
Okay.
And our job is to slowly lower and lower that barrier so that it becomes really simple to be able to create these narrative games.
So the writer can then focus on the story and the creativity. So I want to get into that in a second, but I want to come back to Charlaine Harris. So what is the project that Charlaine Harris is involved with you guys with? What is that all
The
about?
name of the project is called Shakespeare's Landlord,
Okay.
and it's part of her Lily Baird series, which is a 5-book series that she wrote back in the mid 90s. And it's got some pretty heavy themes to it. And so Lily Baird's character has been previously abducted, assaulted, and some pretty horrible things happened to her. And now she finds herself remaking her life in a small town and caught up in a murder. It's not what you would consider traditional fare in games.
Okay.
First of all, female protagonist. Second of all, we are using the themes of PTSD and sexual assault in the game in a respectful way
Okay.
to have that conversation. Players will experience, the flashbacks, the heightened breathing, but in a way that doesn't glorify the violence.
Right.
It's kind of intense that way. We really want people to have a sense of empathy when it comes to PTSD. So that's our challenge, is to adapt that first novel in the series.
Okay.
And we have pushed out the publication date on that, mostly because we're also building in an alternate path. And we've got some great voiceover actors that have come on board. And we really want to make sure we do this right.
Okay. Now I think you recently announced a voiceover actor, Julia Gibson, and why is that important?
Well, we're super excited. I was looking for who was going to be the voice of Lily Baird.
Okay.
Now, I love reading books on like actual paper and ebooks, but I've also really gotten into audibles. And I will say that Julia Gibson, the performer of the Shakespeare series Audible,
Hmm.
really got in our head because we hear her as Lily.
Okay.
And as we were auditioning some voice actors, one of them said, "Well, who do you really want?" And I said, "I'd love to get her." And she goes, "Well, why don't you just ask her?" And we did.
Okay.
So, and she's super excited because she also, because of the nature of the content, she feels a very strong affinity to Lily
Okay.
and felt it was important to be able to be part of this project. So, yeah, we just announced it yesterday. We're super excited about it.
That is really amazing. So the other thing I think that stands really strong is a lot of times when people think about video games, they think about teenage boys and they think about violence. And I think that's one thing that sets One More Story games up as different. And there's sort of a branding that you use to explain it in a nutshell to people.
I sometimes say it's smart games for smart women,
Yeah, that's what I heard.
or it's games for word nerds. It's interesting with the addition of having Julia come on as the voice actor. And I was playing through the game. I was bug testing last night. There's Our games are narrative heavy. You get into the introduction for Shakespeare's Landlord, and there's the equivalent of a page and a half worth of text.
Okay.
That is not what you're going to see in a traditional video game. And I just sat there and I imagined her reading out that text. So now it's become more than just an ebook video game hybrid. It's an ebook audiobook video game hybrid.
Right.
And so if you really love the world of your author, you get to see this in a new visual way. Like, we've worked very, very diligently to honor Charlaine's world down to the little details. I think one detail somebody might harp on us for is that the cookies at Mrs. Hofstetler's are chocolate chip and they're not Fudgios. But you know, it's they don't look very appealing when it's just a big bomb blob on a plate. But it's all of the other attention to detail,
Right.
and it's bringing your books to a completely different place. And I don't feel like a lot of video game companies are interested in narrative, like they say that they are, but their focus is on glitz and glamour and getting people to buy, like using that slot machine mechanic.
Right.
We wanted to build something for story. Story is the central driving mission of our company.
Okay. So how would a writer who's interested in getting involved with this, how would they get started? What would you recommend that they do?
I would say that the best place for people to start is to go and play a game or two of ours. A really great low entry game would be the Attack of the Killer Zombie Cats,
Okay.
which is purely 10 minutes, right? It's 10 minutes. Another really great one is it won second place for Game of the Year 2 years ago. It's called Hard Vacuum Lullaby.
Okay.
And that is an example of an adult who's written a game. It's half an hour in total, and it has 8 different endings. So you start to get a sense of, oh, okay, there's not a lot of art assets in it.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be about the visuals. So that's a really great one because it's half an hour, so it gives you a good sense of it. And it all depends on the kind of story you want to tell. If you've always wanted to do like a detective game,
Right.
then I would say Mandatory Upgrade, which is set in Hamilton of all places, is a really great one to look at because that was the first game where players could go and interview other non-player characters, NPCs in the game. So what we're trying to do is we build our catalog of games, or build the different kinds of games. They all still use StoryStylus, but the way the player interacts with the world is very different.
Okay.
Now, once they've done that, they can go over to YouTube and they can check out our how-to videos. We've seen people create entire games just using our how-to videos,
Really?
and we have mostly an extensive FAQ list, so we're getting better at it too. It's still very much in beta, and we'll be opening that up later this year once we get Charlaine's game out there.
That is really, really cool. Now, you recently did a TEDx talk, and the topic was what 10-year-olds taught you about your tech startup business. What did they teach you?
Oh my gosh, so many things. 10-year-old, and thank you. I had a lot of fun doing my TEDx. 10-year-olds are incredibly brutally honest, as you know.
Yes.
When we first got in there that very first week, we realized that we hadn't made the software available so that concurrent users could use it. Because our development team was so small and nobody was ever in there at the same time, it wasn't something that we had actually thought to test for,
Okay.
which seems pretty basic, but it was like, okay, here are some fundamental things that we have overlooked. And they found some bugs with some other elements of the system. And that summer, we alternated weeks. So it would be camp and then development, camp, development, camp, development, and so forth. By the time we got back to the third week of camp, we had sorted out all of the bugs, which was really fantastic. And we started to see the acceleration of these kids being able to create the content. I think we also got better at teaching.
Right.
And by the time we rolled around to the second year, we had improved the software so much, we had become better teachers, but more importantly, we now had a whole library of 20 plus games from the previous year that
Mm-hmm.
the kids could now effectively benchmark themselves against other kid creators. And
Okay.
I think that if, as a writer, if you're thinking, I want to write a novel and you want to be the next George R. R. Martin, perhaps that is not a good benchmark.
Right.
Maybe start with a novelette, maybe start with a novella, right?
Okay.
And so we had these effective little games, and the kids were able to go, you know what, I can do that, and I can do so much more. Their imaginations were amazing. We saw kids doing voiceovers by the time they were done their games at the end of the week.
Okay.
It was humbling and inspiring at the same time.
Yeah. So in the camp, are the kids? It seems like they get to be involved in multiple different aspects of the game. So some of them are the creators, some of them are obviously the performers, or some of them the artists. How does that all come together?
Yeah, so in the camps that we ran ourselves here in Barrie, we typically the kids are between 12 and 16 years old. That's the age range that I find that they're most, I want to say most productive, but they're just the most fluent in being able to create a story game on their own.
Okay.
They write it. In the case of Zombie Cats, you'll see that Kira did some of her own art.
Okay.
They then code it. They're responsible for doing the research on their background music and if they want to do voiceovers and stuff like that. When we went to teach, Microsoft hired us and they asked us, could you come and teach our kids ages 7.5 through 12? And I went, oh my God, that's young. And so what we ended up doing is we put them into 2 groups of 5 kids each. These are all girls.
Okay.
And they ended up gravitating towards the role that suited them best. So one was really great at writing. One was really great at drawing. You had your program manager in there, the bossy kid. You had the kid that liked to break stuff, so she was QA.
Right.
And it was really cool to sort of see that dynamic happen where they gravitated towards their own thing. And the little anecdote that I share in the TED Talk, my group of 5, we were making the non-scary story,
Okay.
right? It was about 2 brother puppies going in the woods for a picnic. And they meet
Okay.
Julio the big bad wolf, who's been ostracized and he's been bullied. Well, we're halfway through the week and the little girl comes up to me. She's 7.5. And I later find out that she watches The Walking Dead, which disturbed me. And she's like, I want to put it in a jump scare. And I'm thinking, what? So she starts drawing this bloody doll. And I was like, okay. Next thing you know, the other 4 girls all want to draw bloody dolls. And we end up putting in, and they're like, can you choose which one's the best? I'm like, nope, not doing that. I know that pitfall. So we end up putting all 5 of the creepy dolls at the end of the game. And as we're looking for the music, because when you're reading a book, unless you're listening to music regularly, I don't normally listen to music when I read books. And when we first started doing our games, we didn't have any background sounds. We didn't have music. And I never really thought about how much they add to the ambiance.
Right.
Well, when I was looking for something appropriately creepy for this ending of the game, I chose a rendition of Ring Around the Rosie, like a really creepy version of it.
Of course.
And the parents were just, they gasped. They couldn't believe that their little girls had drawn this. So it's a testament to, don't assume that all girls love princesses.
Right.
It's girls like horror too. And also what's possible when you say yes to imagination and you don't shut people down.
No, I love that.
So I think that's been the biggest learning for us in the last 3 years is there are so many cool stories that people have. They just need the tools to be able to share them.
That's fantastic. I'm just writing that down because that's a fantastic quote.
Oh, all right. I like that.
That is absolutely inspirational. So this is a tool that, how much does it cost for a writer to use StoryStylus?
We let people come in and use it for free for 3 months
Okay.
to see like if this is something that they want to be able to use.
Right.
Beyond that, it's currently priced at 30 Canadian per year at the lowest tier.
Okay.
We're in the process of changing some things up. We want to keep it affordable because accessibility is important to us. Now,
right.
I had somebody say $30 a year is too much for authors. Well, at that point, that might not be the author that we want to work with.
Right.
I can see people, they're already using this as a prototyping tool. We've had authors who use it to develop their own worlds, not necessarily to publish as a game, but to deepen their own story creation.
Oh, okay. So it's
Yeah.
more of a creative tool that they use to work out elements potentially from the novel that they're writing.
Yeah, we are just talking to somebody recently who's written an entire RPG, a role-playing world, and imagine being able to take your entire role-playing world, plop it in there, and then we would make that available to other users.
Oh, neat.
So the idea that you're creating your own multiverse that other people can then create content from.
That is an amazing collaboration machine when you look at it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So we're just scratching the surface. We've spent the last 4 years developing the technology, developing content at the same time. So we're on both sides of that platform right now, and it's challenging with a small team, but we're making it work.
Well, that's fantastic. I look forward to the amazing things you're going to be doing in 2018. Is there anything you can share about what may be forthcoming?
Sure. Well, I just want to put in a plug for our latest game, our latest award-winning game, which is Danielle's Inferno. And it was adapted from a novella by Michelle McGee, or pen name Michelle Renee, and we turned that into a 2.5 hour game with her. And
Okay.
it won for Game of the Year, Best PC Game of the Year in Toronto this month,
Oh, that's
which was
awesome.
super exciting. It's fun because I read this novella and I went, this would make a really interesting journey through hell. And so there's that. We're working on Charlaine's game. That's going to tie us up for the next 6 months.
Right.
And beyond that, we're working on an interactive Indigenous poetry project
Oh, neat.
and taking poetry from 5 nations, and different languages will be spoken, and different art styles and different music from the various communities. We're working on an adaptation of another novel, which is an anti-bullying piece for youth.
Okay.
So as we move into late 2018 and 19, what we want to see is um, not only fiction writers, but we want to see children's authors because they are at an advantage.
Right.
They already have a visual style for their world. They might already have a lot of the art, and they can put together a 10-minute game that complements their books
Right.
within 20 hours. Because if Kira can do it in her camp,
Yeah.
then we can help authors create promotional pieces or full standalone games.
Oh, that is fantastic. I think the possibilities are endless for this interactive, collaborative storytelling. Jean, thank you and Blair so much for bringing this to the world.
Well, thank you for having us on the show.
And so where can people find out more about you and One More Story Games?
OneMoreStoryGames.com or story.games is our secondary domain. And there you'll be able to find the games that you can play. If you click on Write Games under the About Us, you'll go over to StoryStylus, which is our website for the game engine. You'll learn a little bit more about how that works. And yeah, we are looking to become the premier destination for narrative games, and that's why we're working with Charlaine Harris. We have some other really amazing best-selling authors that we're looking to hook up with this year as well.
Well, that is fantastic. Congratulations, and thank you for joining me today.
Thanks again.
There are so many things that inspire me about what Jean and her husband Blair are doing with One More Story Games and StoryStylus. But among those are the underlying message that the existence of a company like this means for writers. Now, writers know that they aren't really in competition with other books and other authors so much as they are in competition for the attention of so many different options that people have for their entertainment time. The creation of a company that focuses on narrative games and allowing authors tools to create games from the stories they've already imagined speaks to the hope that I see which exists in the world. This is an example of the fact that, regardless of how technologies advance, there will always be a need for story and for storytellers in the world. I also want to reflect on a concept Jean mentions in the interview. And this is, in particular, advice for you if you're considering giving StoryStylus a test drive. Don't start with a complex novel or multi-volume epic to try out the software. Start out with a short story, a game that might run perhaps 10 minutes. In the way that when I first started writing, the common advice was for a writer to cut their chops on short stories before building a name for themselves and then trying to get an editor or agent interested in publishing the novel. It follows a similar pursuit. Try it out, learn the tricks, optimize your own approach to creating a basic simple story before attempting a monolithic epic. Admittedly, I haven't yet given StoryStylus a try, but I'm curious to test it out and will very likely first try something really short just to see how it all works, just to get a sense of the place, and then maybe work on something more complex afterwards. I think that makes a lot of sense. It kind of relates to what I mentioned at the opening of this podcast. I mentioned feeling under the weather, and I want to address that a bit and compare my recent training for a half marathon that I've been talking about throughout the beginning of this podcast with the journey a writer often goes through. So, just to recap, at the end of April, I am going to be running in a half marathon. So I started training for this half marathon at the beginning of 2018. Now, this requires a dedication of multiple runs per week with an extended longer run each weekend, working your way up to the 21-kilometer goal. A couple of weeks ago, the treadmill in our basement died, and I wasn't able to complete my training in the Ontario winter. Now, admittedly, I don't own cold weather training clothes, just running shorts and a running top. So I fell a bit behind. When I was on the Oregon coast from February 23rd through to March 6th, I also didn't get any running in because I was so busy finishing off reading the tail end of the 1.2 million words I was critiquing to authors for the Fiction River Anthology workshop, as well as working with my co-author to put the finishing touches on the first draft of our non-fiction book, Macabre Montreal, that we had to turn into the editor this past weekend. And then returning back late Tuesday night, I came down with a nasty cold and flu-like symptoms. I spent much of the day yesterday and today sleeping and working to fight this off. Now, I could let the 2 weeks of missed training screw my plans to run the half marathon at the end of April, or I could look at the time left and see how I might carefully adjust my training plan to get myself back on track. It might also mean finding the money to buy winter running pants and a winter running jacket. It might be temporarily getting a membership at a local Y. But I know if I commit myself to a solution, I can do it. Similarly, I've looked at all the unfinished books I've started. The sequel to my thriller Evasion that I wrote the first 50,000 words of during NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, a couple of years ago that I still haven't finished. And then the sequel to my other thriller, A Canadian Werewolf in New York, that I wrote a little more than 50,000 words on during this past November's NaNoWriMo and also haven't finished. I could look at that or the various short story projects that I ended up putting on the back burner while I was working 60 to 70 hour work weeks for the past several years. I could do that. Or I could figure out a way to chip away at those unfinished tasks. Like the training, it's not something I'll be able to do in one fell swoop. It's something I'll work at, chapter by chapter, bit by bit, word by word. And I'll keep working at it until it's done. I've done it before, and I'll do it again. I'm going to take Jean's advice for authors using StoryStylus and attempt to break the writing goals into smaller, more achievable chunks of writing. Instead of looking at the 20 to 30,000 words needed to finish one of those thrillers, for example, I'll see how each writing session where I write just 500 or maybe even 1,000 more words gets me closer to that goal. I'll take the time to celebrate the small victories, and I'll get back on that writing treadmill and make it happen. I hope that you also found inspiration in Jean's words, and perhaps even in my own reflections. Feel free to share your own strategies for how you might be approaching your own writing goals in the show notes for this episode at starkreflections.ca. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Well, that's it for episode 10 of Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre, wishing you all the best in your own writing and publishing goals, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.